Some entrepreneurs fail because they quit too early, but most fail because they quit too late. And I didn't want to be one of those. So when I turned 58 years old, my company had been in business for over 30 years. I thought it was about time for me to quit and sell the company. And so I've got some reasons for that, and I'm going to talk about them here, but I've also got some other reasons that I think you need to highly consider. First, most important reason is, do you have the drive to continue? If you've lost that drive, and I'm not talking about after you've just barely started a company and you've only been in business for a few years. I'm talking about after being in business for several years. If you've lost that drive, that willing to take on all the battles and the fights that you're going to have, then it's time to sell the company, because it takes 100% effort from that CEO owner to run that company. And that was the case with me. I knew I wasn't 100%, and I wanted to get somebody in there that I felt like had more drive than me. Second reason that you need to consider is, if your wife, family, spouse is not supportive of what you're doing at that company and all the effort that you're putting in, if they're not supportive of that 100%, then I think you got to consider selling the company, because that company needs to be as important as any family member, including your wife. And your wife needs to understand that if that company needs attention, then you're going to have to give it attention. If she's fighting you all the time, then you don't want to get divorced, then you got to seriously consider selling that company and doing something else. Third reason to quit, would be if you come down with a physical ailment or a disease, a life-ending disease, or something that you're going to be battling for, an infinitive amount of time, a time that you don't understand or don't know, then I think you've got to think about selling. And for the exact same reasons, if your wife's not supportive, if you're not 100%, or if you don't have the drive, if you're not 100%, the CEO is the most important person in that company. So if you're fighting a disease or fighting a battle, a health battle, and you're not 100%, then whatever you are, that means that company is that. So if you're 50% of the time focused there, then that means the company is only operating 50%. So it's time to sell the company. Another reason to sell would be if you don't have enough cash to compete. And what do I mean by that? Not necessarily borrowing capacity. I really mean the risk appetite. Because let's say that you're in an industry and there's some competitors out there that got a huge appetite for risk, and they're willing to put in a massive amount of capital, a lot more than you, to compete. Then maybe it's time for you to sell that company if you're not willing to take that risk. And it might even be possible to sell your company to one of those, to one of those competitors that does have that risk, that appetite risk. Another reason to sell the company would be if your growth rate is starting to slow down. And usually that means because one or two things: either your overall marketplace is not growing that you're in, or you're approaching 50% market share. Either one of those, or both. If you're starting to get to a point where your company is at a very low growth rate, or you foresee that coming, then it might be time to sell that company, because the value of your company is dependent upon that growth rate. In other words, the higher the growth rate, the more the worth of your company is. The other thing you've got to another time you got to consider selling would be if your management team is not willing to finance your retirement. If you're ready to retire and that they don't want to finance it, in other words, they don't want to buy the company, then it's probably time to sell to someone that is willing to do that. And it's the same thing with your kids. Now with me, my kids did want to work at the company, but I just had a moral thing. I didn't want them to work at the company. So there was no opportunity for them to finance my retirement, because I wanted them to build their own careers, and I would rather sell the company and finance their ventures. And that's what I'm doing. I sold the company and I'm financing their ventures that they're in. And finally, the final reason to sell the company would be if the cycle for selling companies and buying companies, venture capital, mergers and acquisition activity, if that cycle is near the top or it's been at the top for a while, it might be time to sell that company because you might not have a better time to sell. And that's what happened with me. I knew that we were at the top of a cycle for companies my size to be sold. And so I took advantage of that opportunity and I sold.